Okay, we're looking today at the imperfect tense and Wallace's grammar, and I'm looking at it in BibleWorks. And if you have BibleWorks, you have BibleWorks 9, you have Wallace's grammar as well. Let's pray and then we'll get started. Father, I pray that our time together today would be profitable. Help me as I teach to be clear and helpful. I pray that the students would have your Spirit's empowerment for learning and understanding. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Now, moving from the present tense to the imperfect tense is a shift in time, not a shift in aspect. Right? The aspect of the imperfect is identical to the aspect of the present. It's an interior view without regard to time. The only difference is the temporal orientation. And that's how Wallace begins his introduction to the tense. And under his introduction, he notes that the imperfect is an internal aspect portraying the action from within the event without regard for beginning and ending, and contrasts it with the aorist, which takes a snapshot of the action. With reference to time, the imperfect is almost always past, and it grammaticalizes time. Are you comfortable with the verb grammaticalize?
I'm not.
Okay.
Every time he uses it, I try to figure out.
Okay. To grammaticalize means to embed in a grammatical form a certain meaning. So we say that tense plus mood, specifically tense plus the indicative mood, grammaticalizes time. It embeds a temporal location in the form. And that temporal location can be stripped out by context or other factors, but the default is time is embedded in the indicative. So this is what puts me and Wallace in Naselli's third category of people who view aspect time as being grammaticalized, whereas he and Carson and Porter, Constantine Campbell, would say that time is never grammaticalized. And the end result is really very little difference in terms of actual interpretation, because context is so formative in shaping our understanding of what's going on. But
and I'm sorry, but can I ask you one more time for the kernel definition? I can wait quite finish it. Embed in a what form? A certain meaning?
To grammaticalize means to embed a meaning in a grammatical form.
Oh.
So, for example, Greek nouns grammaticalize gender. They grammaticalize number. They grammaticalize syntactical relations. Subject, object, possession, and so on. Then Wallace talks about the specific uses, by which we mean the pragmatic meaning of the imperfect, and he talks about narrow bands, where the action is portrayed as being in progress or occurring in past time. And three different types: instantaneous, progressive, and ingressive. The imperfect is rarely used just like an aorist indicative to indicate simple past tense. This usage is virtually restricted to elegans and in narrative literature. Even with this verb, however, the imperfect usually bears a different nuance. So in Matthew 9:24, we have Jesus speaking to the people who were weeping and wailing at Jairus' house. And he says, Elegan, literally, he was saying, depart, for the little girl is not dead, but is sleeping. Okay. So the question is, does Matthew's use of the imperfect intend to communicate to us that Jesus said this repeatedly? Does it intend to communicate to us that we're being put inside the action, so to speak, and we're hearing it transpire in the past? Or is it just really no different than an aorist? Now, this is where paying attention to a specific author's usage pattern is going to be important. And because I'm not, a Greek prof by PhD level research, I've never had the opportunity or time to do the kind of analysis that could say, well, here's Matthew's distinct use of aorist versus imperfects, or Luke's use of them. Can we tell a difference? Matthew, who supposedly has a Hebraic background, is he using the imperfect the way we would expect based on standard Koine grammatical usage, or are there variances? Okay. And one of the dangers with a New Testament syntax like this is it levels authorial style considerations. And we all know just from our own personal experience that even though people talk English, they don't use it all the same way. And some people's usage is sufficiently peculiar to say, well, that's just the way he says it. He doesn't mean anything different by that than the way we say it. Okay. But when you take this kind of cut a core through the middle of the New Testament and determine the least common denominator of usage, then it's at least possible that we are flattening the linguistic landscape in ways that if Matthew were here or Luke were here would say, oh, no, you're making more out of that or less out of that than ought to be made. And these are just the realities of working with language that is accessible to us only through text. And so we do the best we can. And I think that awareness should put us a certain, it's just like a caveat at the end of the paragraph, yes, all this, but be aware X and could be different, and so we'll remain flexible in our categories. Okay. Mark, he was saying, whoever has ears, let him hear. Okay. So, Wallace's analysis of these is that they're heuristic or instantaneous. There's really no ongoing progression involved in the communication at all. Any questions about the instantaneous imperfect? Okay. Next comes the progressive imperfect. And the progressive imperfect just views the action in progress. It was happening. the vast majority of imperfects are progressive, so that's what you would kind of default to. You would assume progressive and then move from there based on lexical, grammatical, or contextual factors. Any questions about the progressive imperfect? Okay, the ingressive, also known as inchoative or inceptive imperfect. I really have to confess my ignorance about the derivation of the term inchoative. It was always incredibly opaque to me and never saw any value in the term, so I never use it. Ingressive, ingress, egress, we use those words in English. So here the imperfect is used to stress the beginning of an action or a process instead of its continued action. Wallace notes that it's especially used in narrative literature when a change in activity is noted. Okay. Now, he has under clarification and amplification the difference between the ingressive imperfect and the ingressive aorist is that the imperfect stresses beginning but implies that the action continues, while the aorist stresses beginning but does not imply that the action continues. What you need to read into that sentence is that the lexeme, grammar, and context all working together with the aspect of the tense stress the beginning and imply that the action continues. Okay. Whereas with the aorist, the lexeme, the grammar, and the context working together with the aspect of the tense stress the beginning of the action, but do not necessarily imply that the act occurs. So, what I just said, I think, is the proper way to communicate what Wallace said, but it's very cumbersome to have to repeat lexeme, grammar, context, plus aspect of verb tense. And because it's so cumbersome to do so, we start using a shorthand, and we just say the imperfect tense does so-and-so. And we really know that it's not simply the tense itself doing that. It's this combination of all of these factors together. So as long as you keep in mind that that's what Wallace means and what I mean when we say X tense does Y, then we're okay. So Matthew 3:5, then Jerusalem literally was going out to him. So that's the question is does this indicate the beginning of the action, like Wallace is suggesting? Contextual factor, then. Then, I don't know if we've got enough context. I don't know the context well enough to know whether this is talking about John the Baptist. Jerusalem began going out to John the Baptist. Just to be completely honest, I've never been quite sure how the idea of an ingressive imperfect was recognized, since I can read this and view it simply as like a large-scale statement about what was going on over an extended period of time. And why do you have to take it as the beginning of the action? And if I had to defend that, I really wouldn't know how to defend it, except to say it's a possibility. Okay, so I would prefer to limit the use of the ingressive imperfect to cases where there's clearly an initiation. I think Matthew 5:2 provides us with that. When he opened his mouth, he was teaching them. Well, he can't teach with his mouth closed, So since that limits the nature of the action, he began a process of teaching. The imperfect here can be ingressive. Okay, his mouth. Okay, so picking up where we left off here, Mark 9:20, he fell on the ground and was rolling about. Well, clearly he began rolling about. Is that Mark's point to emphasize the beginning of the rolling? Or is it just to say that after having fell on the ground, he was rolling? I don't know. And, they came out of the city and were coming to him. Here, Wallace argues for a subtle contrast between the aorist and imperfect. The aorist gets the Samaritans out of Sychar in a summary fashion. The imperfect gets them on the road to Jesus. But it looks at the action from the inside. The evangelist leaves the reader hanging with this tantalizing morsel. They were coming to Jesus but had not yet arrived. Dramatically, the scene shifts to the dialogue between Jesus and his disciples, leaving the readers with some unfinished business about the Samaritans. They appear on the scene again in a few minutes when Jesus declares, "Lift up your eyes, for they are white unto harvest. The Samaritans have arrived." Okay, I think that's a legitimate analysis of what's going on in the narrative drama. I'm not sure that it depends on taking it as an ingressive imperfect. The same analysis would hold whether you took it as a progressive imperfect or an ingressive imperfect. Okay.
So, in a way, I mean, if you have a progressive perfect and you're using the language in that way, I mean, because of the contextualized cues, the reader is left to make the inference for themselves, just naturally, that, of course, when they come out and go towards Jesus, if they're
beginning the process, yeah, right.
Instead of needing to make that sort of explicit, it's just something that we naturally do.
I think so.
When we read.
I think so. All right, broadband imperfects, like the present tense, several imperfects involve a time frame that's fairly broadly conceived. However, unlike the present tense, there is no gnomic imperfect. So under this section, he has the iterative imperfect, repeated action and past time. Two types of iterative. Iterative proper, in which the imperfect indicates repeated action by the same agent, and distributive. Okay, that's important. We can talk about a distributive iteration in which the act happens multiple times, but the actors change. Many grammarians make no distinction between the iterative and customary imperfect. However, while the customary is repeated action in past time, it has two elements. The iterative imperfect does not. Regularly recurring action, an action that tends to take place over a long span of time. Thus, in some sense, it might be said that the customary is a subset of the iterative. I agree. I think that's what I argued for the customary with the present tense. That the iterative present is the larger category. The customary is a subset of iterative with regularity added in. And he's saying the same thing about the imperfect. He notes the use of the gloss keep on doing or keep going or repeatedly or continuously doing. Those are ways to translate. Any question about the iterative imperfect?
I have a question on his example from Matthew 9:21.
Okay.
She was saying within herself.
Mm-hmm.
In his notes, he said this, of course, may fit some other imperfect category, but the iterative imperfect best fits the context and psychology of the narrative.
Right.
Picture painted seems to be a desperate woman who repeats over and over again. I'm just wondering how objective that analysis is.
It's the objectivity. The most objective element of the analysis is the recognition of an imperfect tense. That's about all there is to it. And, it's a little unfortunate because Wallace has argued that elegant is often aoristic. But here's a case where he doesn't want to make it aoristic. Instead of having it she said in herself, he wants to make it she was saying.
I mean, he's really stretching some context here. I mean, he's talking about her psychological state and everything.
Well, he's saying if a person was saying a thing repeatedly within themselves, what might that indicate about their psychology? It's not that he's bringing psychology to bear on that. He's inferring from the use of the imperfect a potential psychological. What's the reference to Keener have to do?
Just the way he likes to decide everything that Paul was thinking and give it exegetical significance as though he knew what Paul was thinking.
Really, where do you run into Keener doing that?
Oh, specifically in my studies on what he, on Ephesians 5, 21 through 23 on men and women.
Oh, okay.
A passage I've written a few papers on in my history.
Alrighty. The Matthew 27:30 example I think is a pretty good one. We've got repeated beating on the head. But here we have lexical intrusion supporting the basic aspect of the tense. To beat somebody with a rod necessarily implies iterative activity. Right? Bang, 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 bang. And each bang is an iteration of the verb to beat. Okay.
I guess, but isn't it a stretch to minimally, I mean, you can say that it could be distributive or iterative, even though, I mean, we'll see.
Yes, in either case. Now, he says it's both distributive.
So, I mean, it would be distributive. I guess I'm wondering, I guess it is iterative in the sense that, it's repeated by the lexical meaning, but it says further the seems to suggest both the distributive and iterative sense, that is, each soldier would strike more than once.
Yeah, I mean,
I guess I would think that would happen.
Yeah.
But I just, minimally, I just don't feel like I could say that just based upon...
It's not based on the tense. It's based on his conception of the reality that took place.
Well, are Matthews or Wallace?
Wallace's.
And with the same
For all we know, maybe each one took one turn, and everybody whapped him once. There were 20 soldiers there, so everybody got to hit him once, and it was distributive.
Would the same thing work for the Matthew 9:21, or is that pretty obvious that this is iterative in the sense that she continues to say within herself?
Well, here's how I approach this. I want to assume that the aspectual significance of the tense is present unless it gets stripped out by lexical, grammatical, or contextual features, which is why I'm leery about his instantaneous imperfect. Okay.
Okay, forgive me. Why are you leery of his instantaneous?
I don't think we did not include an instantaneous, and I think that reflects my leeriness about it because I can't see how either lexically or grammatically or contextually the progressive internal aspect of the imperfect is stripped out of most of the examples that he gives.
So in this case, the progressive nature wouldn't be stripped as well. So
right.
By the very nature of the tense,
yes.
It would be her,
so
instead of this being an instantaneous, she's just saying.
Yes.
Because that's what I was thinking it might be.
So I like his analysis here and say, yes, I think repetition's involved, and that's the natural thing with this aspect to assume, progressive aspect, internal aspect, so some kind of ongoing action. And is there anything in the context, lexeme, or grammar that would strip that away? No, I don't see anything, so I'm going to assume it's there. and I feel like most of his examples under the instantaneous imperfect also lack those three factors stripping away the progressiveness. So, there's an alternative to what I'm saying would be, no, you have to demonstrate how the lexeme, the grammar, and the context support the analysis that this is progressive. And if you go that way, essentially what you're saying is